I think anytime I use the word type, I'm talking very specifically about a system.
Yes.
Anytime I'm using the word personality, I'm talking about a whole human being.
That's right.
Or whole human beings are represented in that. And our type is not our personality.
That's correct.
Right? Even though they go together in personality type, they should not be conflated. Our type is not our personality, and our personality is not a type.
That's right.
It's trying to say that there is a style that some people show up with in their personalities.
Yeah.
And there's a limited set number of patterns of those styles. And we're going to talk about this one style or this system's, set amount of styles or patterns.
Yeah.
But I think when we go back to personality, if you say that's that person's I'm an ENTP, that's my personality. It's not even close.
Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So if you are only listening to us, you're going to hear some water and rain sounds in the background. If you're watching, you're going to see that it's actually raining. We're outside right now. Well, we're under a second level of a porch, and we got everything set up because we're in between studios. We're going to record, we got it all ready to go, and then it started raining. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty okay because we planned for that, but there might be a few drips that could make it through this little metal thing that's holding back the rain. So
yeah, somebody listening or watching is like, I hear a couple drips.
Yeah.
That's me and you. We're the drips.
I know.
So
no one's gonna get that reference.
I know, because drip is so old. That's why I had to explain it.
Even when my mom said that as a kid, I didn't get that reference. She had to explain it to me.
Right.
That's how old it is.
It's an old timey expression, like Abraham Simpson talking about tying a belt or an onion to his belt, which was the style at the time. I'm like, there's a couple drips over there, and people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Last week and the week before, it was the ambient nature sounds of birds. And now it's rain. I almost
feel
some
Pennsylvania gunshots every once in a while.
And some Pennsylvania gunshots every once in a while. I feel like this should be legit our ASMR episode.
Just ambient noises.
Just ambient noises and us talking like this with lots of S's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could do a real chill, lean back episode.
Right. With a little jazz music.
Yeah.
Introing.
This is one of those afternoons where it's a summer afternoon at the time of the recording. It's one of those you just grab a book on the porch, the rain's falling around you, cup of coffee.
Sit with a cat.
Yeah, you're chill.
Yeah, you're
it's
chill.
All good.
But that's not how we do things around here. Let's talk about deep psychological concepts.
Let's do it.
With the rain in the background.
That's right.
All right. And so that was the one Personality Hacker podcast where we bantered at the beginning. That's it. In 10 years, you get one.
I don't know. There's been some reviews. People are like, get to the point. And I'm like, do we ever talk about our experience or our hey, what'd you do this weekend? I never remember us ever doing that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's not because we're talking about incidental things. I think it's because we're talking about and extroverted intuition things. I think it's because we go off on rabbit trails that are interesting to us.
Yeah.
And and people are like, and all the extroverted thinking people out there are like, get to the point.
Yeah. Well, I make a comment back. I said, your refund check is in the mail.
That's right.
It's on the way. Sorry, we wasted your time. I'm so sorry.
Well,
you were put upon by this.
You can't refund their time. We stole it from them forever.
Right.
Okay, so
we robbed it.
That's sufficient. That's the longest whether or not we've ever bantered before, that's the longest banter we've ever done.
Man, and we're coming up on 500 episodes soon.
Yeah, maybe we're getting to that point where it's been 10 years. I think I'm just going to sit here and talk about the rain.
Well, we could do that, but I do have something I want to talk about today. And if you're ready to launch into it,
I
can.
I'm ready.
All right.
Let's get deep.
Well, and I think it speaks to some of that get to the point conversation we get feedback from, because one of the challenges we have in talking about personality types is that personality type is very dynamic and contextual, as far as I'm concerned. And when somebody comes to one of our programs for coaching, or they're in one of our mentorships or something like that, or they're doing private coaching with us, or even one of our coaching people that's on the team here, it really depends on what's going on for that person, the advice you would give them. Because if I'm talking to an ENTJ, well, it depends on what your experience is. How old are you? What part of life are you in? What is your current challenge? Is it relational? Is it career? There's so many things that type can influence or help with, but I need to know your situation. And so sitting down to do this podcast, I'm happy we're at 500 episodes, but the challenge is to find ways to make this principle-based, because we don't want to give anybody a narrative to go run off, go do this if you're this type, because it may not be the right advice for you, but we try to talk about things in principles, and so that kind of creates rabbit trails. It doesn't have a nice bow sometimes to tie it up at the end. We often give action steps, but I think it's a challenge to talk about type because of those reasons. And so what people have to do is they overgeneralize, they give advice it's not going to actually work in all situations in order to speak to a generalized audience, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we like type, those of us who like type, we like type because it simplifies things that are too complicated to understand in a single lifetime.
Yeah.
Our identity, right?
Yeah.
It's way too complicated to understand in one life. I mean, we're going to die not knowing ourselves completely because we're ever emerging. So the thing we became the day of our death, we didn't get to fully explore that thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that when you're talking about a system that makes something as complex, arguably the most complex thing in the universe that we know of, which is consciousness and identity and self-reflection and, you know, going down the rabbit trail of who am I and why am I here and existentialism and all that stuff, we find ways to simplify it so that we can access it at all as on-ramps, as access points to ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we do that, there's always a question of, have we gone too far in the simplification process, right? Like, are we at a point where we've become so simple in our access point that it's no longer helpful? It's no longer an access point.
Yeah.
It's just, it's now become its own thing. And you can see when that happens because we start to serve the model.
Yes.
When it's become so simple, it doesn't reflect us anymore, but we still love the model because we know how much power is in there.
Yeah.
The turning point is when we start behaving in a way that's consistent with how we think the theory is supposed to have diagnosed us. Does that make sense? It's like when I start saying that I have I no longer say I have ENTP preferences and explain certain things about me. When I start going, I'm an ENTP and therefore I have to act in an ENTP way.
Yeah.
Now I'm serving the model.
Yeah.
And I think that there is some challenge there. It's like when does it start being harmful to us? When does it stop losing its original intent? I think that that's an important question.
Yeah, and I think ease of accessibility. If you make Myers-Briggs and personality types accessible, that's great because people that maybe aren't initiated into it, they don't know a lot, can get access to it. The challenge with possibly making it accessible is like you said, you might diminish some of the fidelity. So there's this tension point. Mm-hmm. I think some people can start more at the access and then move into some of the depth, which is really what we would encourage people to do. Because I think, so as an example of something really latching on to people, my parents, when I was a kid, had this book on the shelf. It was called the Birth Order Book. And it was a very simple, I would call it a typology system, but it was just basically like quick and dirty. Like if you're the oldest child, or if you have an oldest child, they're going to have some of these characteristics. If you have a middle child, second-born child, they're going to have some of these characteristics. The baby, the family is going to have some of these characteristics. And the person that wrote the book, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, basically was talking about there's some predictive ways that certain children are going to show up in a family unit. And this is kind of a predictable model. Now, it doesn't always bear out, but it's predictable enough. My parents loved it. They would often say, "Oh, Joel, you're the firstborn. So of course you're doing that because you're the firstborn." Or, "Well, that behavior would explain because firstborn, oh, that's a struggle." Yes, that's a struggle firstborns have a lot. And my brother's the secondborn. There were only two of us in the family. So, "Oh, you're secondborn." Or both my parents identify as, well, they are secondborn children. And so they would really take that on too. I was the only firstborn in the family. So there were these narratives that were created around these very simple access points around what I would consider a typology system of sorts. But the more I've been thinking about it, what it really was, it was an archetype system. I was the archetype of the oldest child. My brother was the archetype, and my parents were the archetype of the second-born child. We didn't have a baby of the family. Had we, we'd have the archetype of the baby of the family too. And I think archetypes are really accessible to people, like really, really accessible. And I think this is where, if you go back to like the 1980s to Kiersey, when he wrote Please Understand Me Too, he was attempting, I think, with the temperaments to create some more archetypical frameworks for people to get access to this that would make sense to them if they didn't want to have to go deep into things like cognitive functions, and like the BB-8 function model, all that stuff. So I think these archetypes, and you can see this even in the Myers-Briggs system, people have tried to apply archetypes, like ENTJ, for example, the field marshal archetype. Do all ENTJs show up like field marshals? Do we know that, Antonia? No, they don't, right? But people have created these archetypes to say, oh, the field marshal, that's how an ENTJ shows up. So now, if someone displays characteristics outside of what, quote, the field marshal is supposed to be, oh, that can't be an ENTJ. That's somebody else, because that doesn't fit the archetype I have in my head. So these are some of the things I think we're playing with in type and in personality. And I'd like to talk through some of the distinctions today, maybe the usefulness of some of these ideas. How can we have a sophisticated, or at least a more useful framework around this?
Yeah. Archetypes are super helpful because they don't have to be explained. And I think it was either Jung came up with the term archetype or one person had before him and he popularized it. I can't remember which direction it goes. But he definitely was the person who used the phrase archetypes enough so that it became, in our collective unconscious. And then, of course, I think the person who really made archetypes a household name is probably Joseph Campbell back in the 80s. He talked a lot about it in like Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Yeah.
So Jung called archetypes primordial. They are something that they're so almost pre-language that they're baked into our unconscious mind and they don't have to be explained. Like we just get that if we see a picture of it or a single word.
Yeah.
The most classic archetype example is parent and child. Like it doesn't matter what time period of history you lived in. It doesn't matter what part of the world you lived in. It doesn't matter what kind of culture you come from.
Language.
You show a picture of a parent and a child, everybody gets it. Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, actually even animals do. Right?
Yeah.
They understand parent-child archetype because when they see a parent and a child, they know, they know to go, if they're a predator, to go for the child because it's more vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
So there's a languagelessness to archetypes that make them very powerful access points.
Well, and somebody can be in the parent archetypical role without being a literal parent. That's the other thing is archetypes, you can almost take them on.
Yeah.
And so I could play the role of a parent and somebody could play a role of a child. We could have that dynamic between us. So even people that aren't actual literal parents can still experientially feel what an archetype feels like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is also interesting.
And even one layer down, we have a parent-child archetype relationship within our own identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why they're so powerful is they're like fractals, right? They're everywhere. They're single examples and then they also explode out to the macro and become metaphors for everything.
Yeah.
And so archetypes that's why they're such powerful access points is because they don't really need to be explained. A field marshal is a very specific term, but when you see somebody leading a charge, nobody has to explain what that is, right?
Yeah.
You know that person is in charge and you know that they're a warrior at the same time. So when we talk about type and we think of it in terms of a complete identity, I think we, on some levels, are sort of missing the point, right? The point being that we all are pre-wired to fit I would say, a subset of archetypes. Like there's a whole bunch of archetypes inside of us. And there's a bunch of archetypes even within our type preferences. Yeah. And so the conversation around that, I think, if we can really get this understanding of like how they work, because I believe that they are the foundation of all typology systems. They're actually, to some extent, the foundation of identity, as are these archetypes. But they're also, because they're so accessible and simple, it means that they have to be something that everybody's quote-unquote eyes have adjusted to. Meaning that, I guess that's my little metaphor to say, going back to that principle that children are technically blind when they're born.
Yeah. Not
because there's anything wrong with their vision, but because their brain hasn't worked out what it's looking at yet. It hasn't like the neural pathways are not there yet to determine what is being seen.
Doesn't have a framework.
Exactly.
For how to interpret what's going on for the visuals.
You got it. And it takes a while. It takes a while for the brain to create enough neural pathways and those little wrinkles, right? To go, oh, this is what I'm looking at. And I think we have a very similar experience when we first start diving into our identity. We start diving into typology systems. At first, we're not 100% sure what we're looking at. And so archetypes provide like a nice, I think of it as like a coloring book level of understanding type. It's real bold lines. There's not a lot of detail or color. It's something that everybody can look at and identify. When we get to a place where we start seeing a bunch of nuance and we start seeing a bunch of gradients and how things aren't so bold, right? Not everything is a bold, clean line. Now it's like we're looking at a work from a master, right? And sometimes they're Monets or Van Goghs, where you've got colors that kind of push up against each other, and that's where the quote unquote line is. Or sometimes they're abstract paintings where you're not 100% sure what you're looking at. You have to interpret it. As our eyes adjust to more complexity of detail, we start to not just see more detail, we start to understand the meaning of that detail. And when it comes to identity and type, we start out with what is basically a coloring book level version of type. Right. And that's when we start. By the way, when our eyes have not adjusted to a more complex picture, we do that human thing where we always believe we're at the acme of understanding. We always believe that we're interpreting things well. We always believe that we have as much awareness as a person can have.
Yeah.
Right. I think of Disney believing that, like, well, what are we going to do in animation? Everything's already been done. And this was before Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Right. So at a certain point, we just go, there's no more to explore. We're at the end. It's like, no. When we're talking about identity, there is no end. You die before you fully explore the self. So I guess wrapping all of that up, I would say that archetypes are incredibly helpful when our quote unquote eyes are adjusting to this concept to begin with. There's something that we can understand without it having to be explained to us. And we can usually identify our own type preference archetypes in, it's like, oh, I all I have to see is a picture of Doc Brown from Back to the Future. And I kind of know I'm not an inventor, right? I'm not a crazy guy with crazy hair riding a time machine DeLorean. But I identify with that character for some reason. For some reason, of all the characters I've seen in any movie up until, and I think I was like, when I saw it in the theater, maybe 7 and 8 years old, it was the first time I really identified with a character. And so there was an archetype there, but it was a coloring book version.
Yeah.
Until our eyes adjust, we have that level of understanding and we can identify, and it gives us a path or like a direction to go in self-awareness and self-understanding. The challenge is when we stop there and we go, that's all I need to know. And in fact, when I go, I need to become Doc Brown. Like, not just I identify with the energy of this character. There's something there, but I have to become Doc Brown in order to really, embody my archetype, embody my personality type. I have to become that.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about archetypes, by the way. As a very kinesthetically wired person, I'm not visual or auditory as much as I am kinesthetic. I'm emotional. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. So what an archetype gives me, it gets me a wordless emotional connection to something. Like, I'm going to be today the warrior. You could embody a warrior archetype. You got to go and maybe you're doing something that's even business or career related, like sales or marketing. But I'm going to be a warrior and get the sales today. You can kind of embody this almost this energy field or this energy cycle of something. It's very woo-woo, it sounds, but you're tapping into a way of being for that day. Or I'm going to be the parent today. I'm going to be the stern father that's going to help set the disciplined tone for my children today, right? I don't do that very often. I should probably do that more. Or whatever, you're embodying. It kind of gives you a playbook, a blueprint. What would a person that is embodying this characteristic or this archetype do in this situation? How would their energy show up? What kind of decisions would they make? It fits me as an ENFP to think in terms of archetypes, because it's what kind of person am I and what would a person like that do?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing, like biographies and all of that, personally to tap into. Mm-hmm. Now, the challenge is if we start to create archetypes where they aren't there, I think and I see this happening now. Like, I would argue if your name is Karen, you probably are having a really tough time of it.
Yeah. Poor Karen.
Because there's an archetype that's been developed. I think men and women, particularly women, middle-aged women, who what most people would describe as meddling in somebody else's affairs or life or going through the world, trying to correct the world out here. We've called those people Karens, right? Oh, that's just a Karen. We dismiss them. And there's an archetype now of this person that's been developed. Now, I don't know if that's an ancient archetype of a person. I don't know if that's just behavior. We're casting an archetypical thing.
We used to call them shrews.
Sure.
That was remember the taming of the shrew?
Is that the word that you think would fit one core? Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
I
Shrews.
think Karens are the new name for what we used to say was a shrew.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the point is, I think even like narcissist, like it's becoming more than just a label of like a disorder or something somebody's going through. It's like now it's who that person is. It's become an archetype of a person. Oh, that's a narcissist. They can never change it. That's an archetype of who they are. Mm-hmm. And it's being calcified for some people.
Yeah.
And I think it's an attempt to create labels to help us understand each other and the world at large. Like, I think it's not well intended. It's intended to be useful. Let's say that. Maybe not well intended. It's intended to be useful. And I don't think it's very sophisticated.
Yeah.
And so I think going back and having some more sophisticated archetypes we could tap into and be as humans and even see other people through, even if we're not using type, even if we're not using personality types in a more nuanced way, I think archetypes can be useful for that.
What I hear you saying is that they help us determine our roles, particularly like for the day.
Yeah.
Right. I need to be in a parent role today. I need to be in a, like a ball buster role today or whatever.
I'm going on a date with my partner. I need to be in a lover, characteristic or archetype today.
Right. Exactly. And so archetypes, I think one thing we can establish or a beachhead we can create is nobody's one archetype. Everybody's all the archetypes.
Yeah.
Right. And that's important because I think part of the challenge is we get this message that we're supposed to be consistent in every way, as in we're supposed to never a consistent, authentic identity is one that is the same every single day.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you dress really differently one day and it's out of quote unquote out of character for you,
yeah,
then you're affected, right? You're being fake that day. When really it might just be a different archetypal energy you're in that day.
Yeah. I think we've all had this experience going to work. How many times has a woman stopped wearing makeup one day and everybody's like, you look really tired because she made a change, right? Maybe trying something different. Or somebody dresses up really nice in like a nice outfit. Like, where are you going today? Why are you dressed so nice? It's like, I wanted to express a different part of myself, right? And that's just like dress and makeup and stuff like that. Imagine like bringing out different characteristics. The people in our lives want to know that they can rely on us to be consistent. I think there's so much uncertainty in the world that, I think I want that too. Like I want people in my life to know, okay, I can rely on that person. They're archetypically going to show up pretty much the same way all the time. If they change, I'm like, well, what does that mean for me?
Right.
Like, if they start to alter, like how do I recalibrate my life? And is that going to make the relationship different, the situation different? And whether it's coworker, spouse, partner, children, extended family, immediate family, like it doesn't matter. I think it creates more uncertainty in us. And so I think that's why we push back on people making those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. That goes back to the phrase Wyatt Woodsmall says, which is people don't want you to change because they've just figured out how to manipulate you as you are.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a very cynical way of saying it, but it does relay the concept that we want people in our lives to be predictable because we're counting on them to show up in certain ways so that we don't have to think about that.
Yeah.
Like understanding ourselves is already so complicated. Now we have to understand everybody else too.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the whole conversation around why we use type to begin with as an access point to simplify things. And it's a difficult, I think this whole thing is a complicated conversation. It's very conceptual. It's very abstract. And in part, it's because there are no clean lines in any of it. We are using type to build frameworks and lines around something that is unmanageably difficult, which is the human essence, right? Consciousness, identity, awareness, personality, all of this stuff is unmanageably difficult. And so we take frameworks and ideas and patterns and we overlay them on top of this complexity, all of this stuff, this unmanageably difficult subject matter.
Yeah.
And then we get really insistent on it. So I think the conversation, I guess, could be encapsulated in, are archetypes and personality types useful or are they harmful?
Yeah.
Right? Do they help us understand ourselves and access who we are and bring complex things to a more manageable place so that we can understand who we are?
Yeah.
Or do they oversimplify and overgeneralize and shove us into boxes?
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's important to remember that type is built on the foundation of archetypes, because archetypes are not things that we invented. They were emergent. They are visual or single word representations of something that is so deeply imbued into the human consciousness that we don't need it explained to us.
Yeah.
So archetypes are not invented. They're discovered.
Yeah.
Right? They're emergent. And typology systems are built on top of these emergent concepts, meaning that a good typology system is not going to be something that has manufactured a box to shove people into. It's not going to be a description of everybody, but then an enforcement that you have to show up with these very limited characteristics because I have decided that this is your type.
Yeah.
So therefore you must be this person, right? And that's why people don't like typology systems, is because they think it's that. They think they're arbitrarily determined boxes that take all human characteristics and then shave some of them out. And go, the people in this box, they're only allowed to have these human characteristics.
Yeah.
And people in this box can only have these human characteristics. When really all humans have access to all human characteristics.
Yeah.
So then what is type? Just like archetypes, it is not something that is supposed to be, sort of manufactured or invented. It's supposed to be emergent and observed.
Yeah.
Right? So I have access to all human characteristics, but there are some characteristics I compulsively bring forward. And there are some aspects of who I am that I can't help but just assume are going to be the leverage points, right? No matter what problem I run into, I'm going to bring certain styles of thinking to those problems. And no matter what situation I run into, I'm going to bring certain characteristics to that situation. That's what type is. It's a compulsion, basically.
Yeah.
And so that's why Jung called it a problem, right? The problem of personality is like the subject line of 5 out of the 10 chapters of psychological types, or 11 chapters or whatever. It's like problem, problem, problem. Another word could just be compulsion, compulsion, compulsion. So type is not intended to be, it's not intended to be served. It's intended to serve us by helping us understand that there are certain compulsions we come with. And archetypes are the building blocks of that, meaning that if we are describing things well, we don't really have to describe much about them at all. We just have to give a visual, almost like a primordial snapshot of how somebody is showing up. And then they go, yeah, I resonate with that. I identify with that. That is the energy that I tend to occupy. Yeah.
So our approach has been, and I think this is where we can start to make some distinctions. It would be hard, I think, for us to just talk about like an ENTJ as the field marshal, because I think that just is too one note. Now, if somebody didn't have any access to personality types, and that was their first access point, and they identified as an ENTJ, that might be a good starting place just to give a sense of the style of that type, right? Kind of, it's a style, it's an archetype of sorts. But again, it doesn't really showcase what I believe the Myers-Briggs system points to, which is the cognition. It's what we're using to learn information and make decisions. It's the process. We literally call them mental processes, right? Cognitive functions. These are functions of the brain to learn information and make decisions. It's functional. Archetypes aren't as functional. They're more illustrative, narrative, topical, energetic in a way. And so what we've done here at Personality Hacker is we've actually used archetypes to help explain the complex system that is like the Myers-Briggs system, because it can be tough to get your head around. So what we did is we created a metaphor. The car model is a perfect example of using archetypes for this. Now, they're just oversimplified archetypes, and we use the car model as a metaphor to say, imagine your mind is a 4-passenger car. You have a driver, the archetype of a driver, right? Or a pilot or a captain, right? This is kind of that archetype, but the driver in a car, they're running the car, they're driving, they're literally making it go where it goes. Then you have a co-pilot sitting next to the driver, a navigational person, right? Even back before vehicles were invented on ships, you had, the first mate or whoever would help the captain steer the ship. So that still holds as in archetypes. You've got the driver, you've got the co-pilot, and then in the back seat, you have children metaphor, or children archetypes, a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old in the back seat. And we use this to help explain someone's cognition. So when you have that 4-letter code, like my Myers-Briggs type is ENFP, that's just telling me what my mental processes are. And, extroverted intuition, it's a heady name. We use the nickname exploration. Introverted feelings, how I make my decisions, authenticity. And so then we place that, my extroverted intuition or exploration is my driver, and my introverted feeling or my authenticity is my co-pilot. Well, now I've got kind of a framework. Okay, my driver, what things does my driver do? What does it do? It takes charge. It's kind of in control of the vehicle. It's moving me through the world. I'm going to really over-identify with that. That's going to be kind of my everything, right? So it starts to speak to people. Oh, okay, now I'm getting a sense of what my cognition does here. It's driving everything. This part of me is really driving things. Oh, the co-pilot. This is helping navigate. This is giving me clarity. This is balancing me out. I get a co-pilot energy. I understand that. Okay, well, that's not all good news. You got some challenge in the backseat, right? You've got this 10-year-old. 10-year-olds want to be loved. They try to prove themselves. They maybe have some ambition. Maybe they have some overconfidence, but still have a lot of uncertainty. So the characteristics of a 10-year-old can be talked about for my tertiary or 10-year-old process of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. Great archetype explanation for that. Oh, okay, I kind of get the characteristics of that. And then the 3-year-old. Well, 3-year-olds sometimes there are temper tantrums. They're just children. They don't really understand a lot. Very black and white thinking, oversimplification, deep uncertainty, like all these characteristics that a 3-year-old might have. And that's my introverted sensing or memory. So I'm looking at my personality through the lens of this car model going, okay, I'm starting to understand more about the parts of myself and how they show up and what each of those parts pull on as tools. Like my driver pulls on the tool of exploration to drive through the world. That's like, I think that's the tool for everything. So we can start to see using these archetypes within ourselves. I think this is where the usefulness comes. More than just saying I'm an ENFP champion. I'm a champion. That's my archetype. That doesn't really help me know how I'm moving through the world to learn and decide things.
Interestingly enough, I think that even if a person didn't know what their Myers-Briggs type was and didn't understand anything about cognitive functions and just heard the car model all by itself,
yeah,
I wonder if there would be value in even just that.
Yeah.
Meaning that, oh, I have 4 parts of myself.
Yeah.
I have a part of me that tends to want to be in charge. I have a part of me that tends to want to, be more of a advisory position, right? I have different parts of myself showing up in different time periods. All by itself could be a game changer for a person.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that makes me think of a book I read in college called This Book Is Not Required. I can't remember the author's name, but she talks about how she was talking about it's for college kids, like how to navigate their college experience. And so I think my sociology professor had us read it. And remember, she talked about this idea. There's a childlike part of me and my partner. And when those two childlike parts are fighting each other, it's disaster. But if I can stay in my parent part and my partner's in their child or vice versa, we can actually navigate the space. But if we're both in our childlike parts, we just can't make it through, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And that stands out to me when you said that. It's like, that was a little framework I got way before I learned type in the depth that I know it now. That was already a framework like, oh, okay, there's like a childlike archetype inside of me. If I'm fighting with my partner or anyone, maybe that's what's going on. It had the question mark, like, well, maybe that's where I'm coming from. And so I could pause and get a little bit of space and check in with the self. So I think, yes, it's absolutely useful, just that framework itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the idea that, and you can see this when people really get super into type, they tend to latch onto every archetype they can.
Yeah.
Right. And we do this too. We did a whole series around God and Goddess archetypes a few years ago, which still remains one of our more popular series. I reference it all the time. I'm always thinking about, Aphrodite archetype. That actually explained a lot about me. It kind of explains why I had some of the experiences I did growing up.
Yeah.
And it's because I identify with this energy and it tends to come out. And if other people's archetypal energies are not friends of our archetypes or they're not friendly towards it, then that might create some clashing. Like you're talking about roles, parent-child archetype roles. Well, if I'm in a child role and you're in a child role, then we're fighting as kids. But if I can just stay in a more parental role and you can stay in a parental role, maybe now we can federate and talk as adults.
Yeah.
That's one way of looking at it. So those are archetype roles. Another way of looking at it is certain, characteristics show up with some archetypes, which are off-putting to other archetype energies. And so you can look at it in terms of roles, and you can also look at it in terms of adjectives and characteristics.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a great way to translate type to people that are uninitiated. So like if you're listening or watching right now and you have somebody in your life that you can't go in, like let's say you're really into this, cognitive functions, the depth, but you could talk about it like almost like what we're talking about. It actually allows me and Antonia to triangulate. If somebody brings another typology system and they're like, this is the one I know. Like I think our friend Joel had one. It's like flags or something, color to flags. And they had different characteristics assigned to them with different color flags. And I remember us just being able to play with that system because we just kind of tied it to archetypes. We tied it to we just tied it to what we already knew, and we just played in that system. We spoke in the language that made sense for the person that brought that to us.
Right.
So I think that the archetypes actually give you flexibility to talk about type itself. That's the other thing I think it provides for us.
Yep, absolutely. And so the foundation underneath type being this understanding of roles that we're going to take on no matter what. Right.
Yeah.
We're all going to take these roles on. It doesn't matter if we have aligned them to any specific system. This is just how humaning works. We all take on roles. There are certain qualities and characteristics that we're going to tend to gravitate towards. We're going to be attracted to some of those characteristics. And so we can talk about characteristics without talking about type. We can just talk about these things that are standard human things, but we are attracted to this, group of standard human things.
Yeah.
And so, again, all of it should be emergent. It should be observing what is already there. It shouldn't be shoving people into a predetermined set of characteristics. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we get so fascinated by type in and of itself, is that we go, this is explaining what already is. This is not forcing me to become something I am not. And if we're doing it right, it's not describing things that I just wish I was. Although sometimes what's funny is I have seen so many times a person go, oh, I worship this type. I wish I was this type. And they identify with a different type. And then like within a couple years, they go, I realized I was that type the entire time. I just didn't think I was cool enough to be it. And it's like, what do you mean cool enough? There's a reason why we're attracted to things that are more like us, right? And not that if you're always super attracted to a type, it means that you are that type. But it's not uncommon for a person to read the characteristics of their type description or their profile and go, I'm not cool enough to be that. I must be some other type.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, because the type you think is less cool is as cool to the people who are actually that type as your type is to you. Meaning that you're like, I'm less cool. I'm this other type over here. And it's like everybody in that type is going to go, hey, what do you mean?
Yeah.
We're actually cooler than the type you are. But we just instinctively go toward the thing that feels the most like the best version of ourselves, really, actually.
Can I do a quick aside?
Mm-hmm.
I'm struggling with the word, and I know why we use it. I use it too all the time. This word type. I prefer the word personality, because type is so specific to like a label or something we adopt, that I like to think in terms of personality, because the personality that I bring is way more than just my Myers-Briggs type. It also includes my archetypes. It includes my Enneagram or other systems, birth order, what you throw it in, right? That's all. And it also has the word, like Dr. Nardi talks about, Dario talks about, it has the word person in it. So it reminds us this isn't a digital system void of people. It reminds us this is here, I'm the NF talking right now, right? This is a system that actually is about people, and it reminds us that people are front and center. And when we just throw, oh, type this, type that, and I do it too. I'm not on your case, Antonia. I'm just saying I think that wires us to think about it a very particular way. And I think it funnels us down to a really digital view of this. And I understand why we do it, but I would love to encourage everyone, you listening or watching too, even though we're using the word type, be thinking about personality, because I think that's really what we're talking to or speaking about.
I think anytime I use the word type, I'm talking very specifically about a system.
Yes.
Anytime I'm using the word personality, I'm talking about a whole human being.
That's right.
Or whole human beings are represented in that. And our type is not our personality.
That's correct.
Right? Even though they go together in personality type, they should not be conflated. Our type is not our personality, and our personality is not a type.
That's right.
It's trying to say that there is a style that some people show up with in their personalities.
Yeah.
And there's a limited set number of patterns of those styles. And we're going to talk about this one style or this system's, set amount of styles or patterns.
Yeah.
But I think when we go back to personality, if you say that's that person's I'm an ENTP, that's my personality. It's not even close. It's just a framework that lives, it's a map that lives inside of a very vast terrain of a lot of different maps, a lot of different space. So I think that's why we use the word type, because in some ways we are trying to separate it out. We're trying to say we're not talking about a whole personality. The challenge is that if an individual does not recognize that that's why we do that, then they might be doing it the opposite as shorthand to conflate the two. I think that's the thing you're taking objection to.
And Jung's book was called Psychological Types, not personality types. I think it, again, speaks to this idea of cognition, the psychological element you're bringing, the way you learn information, the way you make decisions, right? Yep. So, okay, so how do we make this applicable? Where do we take this now? This idea of we have archetypes, which I think are more useful from within us to help us understand how we're wired from a personality standpoint, no matter what system. I think even Enneagram, you can use an archetype there to help understand things. Use something like birth order. I'm sure human design has some archetypical energies to it. Like any system you're using, archetypes, I think, can help us understand the system initially. But then I think there's an element here with Myers-Briggs where it can help us understand deep into the system. Like we look at John Beebe's 8-function model. I don't want to go into it here. It's pretty technical and deep, but it basically gives an archetypical energy, 8 archetypical energies that live inside of us. And then when we're in that energy, we tend to pull on the function, the cognitive function, cognitively, that's associated with that energy depending on our personality type and our wiring. So I think that's another way that archetypes can help inform. So, I hear this thing online all the time. ENTP. Somebody might say, well, when you're in stress or you're going to your shadow functions, which are ego dystonic functions, getting real technical. If you don't know what this is, we're going to get back to stuff.
Forget the phrase ego dystonic.
Yeah, but if you're in your ego dystonic functions, what they're technically called, you're just going to flip from ENTP and become an INTJ. You're just going to be an INTJ when you're in shadow. And we've talked to Dr. John Beebe about that. That would mean that there has to be coordination among all those functions in your shadow. And that simply just they're not that coordinated. They're more random access. They don't show up in a nice coordinated, nice tidy bow and you flip from being an ENTP, Antonia, to being an INTJ. That's not how that works.
Think Jeebus.
But you do tend to bring out, when you're maybe stressed or you're going in your shadow, one of the 4 archetypes typically shows up in a dominant way. It kind of takes over for a moment.
Yep.
You might be in your trickster energy archetypically. As you're going to pull on those energies, you're going to be in that mode. That's more likely to come from your shadow than an entire organized quartet of a type.
Yeah.
Right? In a nice, tidy bow. That's not how any of our coaching, any of our students, any of our client work has ever turned out. That's not how it shows up.
Well, that's using what would make sense if you are only looking at things through the lens of tidy theory.
Yeah.
It makes the most sense if everything is a tidy theory. And if you don't understand that John's model is more referring to archetypes than it is to functions.
Yeah.
That's the crazy thing. That was the game changer for me when we started talking to John. I was like, oh, you're actually more putting focus on the archetypes than you are on the functions themselves.
Yeah.
Like you said, we're not going to go super deep, but I think we recorded a podcast about it. So if you want to get more into Dr. John Beebe's 8-function model, you can go reference that podcast. But yeah, exactly. It's like if I was to become an INTJ when I'm in my shadow, quote unquote, it means I'd be pulling on 4 different archetypes simultaneously, and it would have to be. It's almost like a coordinated attack from all 4 of the parts of me that are designed to keep me safe. It is very unlikely I'd be in all 4 of those simultaneously. So it is very unlikely I'd be pulling on all of their associated functions simultaneously and in the order of descension to become, quote unquote, an INTJ. That just doesn't like that. It would be so unlikely as to be unreasonable to believe that would be what happens.
Yeah.
But that's a misunderstanding of how we are in archetype energy. An archetype, when we're embodying it, again, like we talked about, it's like a role, right? And because we're in a role, it's very hard to play 2 roles at the same time. We already know. We get really frustrated with that in life. I have to both be a parent at this moment, and then I also have to be somehow a business leader. Or I have to be in a childlike energy to play with my kid, but at the same time, I also have to be in, like this other role that might, require more sophistication or maturity from me than childlike play. And so even when we're at our best and life circumstances are good, it is hard to pull on multiple archetype roles at the same time. When we're in our shadow or when we're dealing with things that feel like an attack, it's very difficult to stay with more than one archetype at that time as well. And I think that's, if I was going to culminate in sort of an understanding of what is it that we're actually talking about other than just being intuitives and, getting off on talking about intuitive stuff.
Although that can be good too.
Yeah, too bad. This is our podcast. We can talk about whatever we want to. We talked about archetypes. We made no points. We landed nothing. We gave you no practical application. Good night.
It was the
right.
It was the anti-rain dance because it stopped raining too. So.
Oh yeah, that's right. It went the opposite direction. So you get to hear a bunch of intuitive stuff with the ambient noises of rain and birds, and that's it. That's our new podcast from here on out. If I were to try to figure out a way to land the plane in this very conceptual conversation around archetypes, I would say that at the baseline of everything we do is a primordial understanding of humanness.
Yeah.
All right, that's also a mouthful, but it's basically like we're acting out roles all the time.
We could say self-evident understanding of humanness.
Exactly. It's like what do? We go through our whole lives acting out age-appropriate roles context appropriate roles, relationship appropriate roles. We are playing roles all the time. We recently did a podcast on persona, which it's like, how do you want to show up in life? What roles do you want to be playing to set yourself up, right? Like, it's really important. And the persona itself is also an archetype, right? Which is the interface between myself and the rest of the world. And what roles do we want to be showing up with? How do we want to communicate who we are?
And society used to give us a lot of templates to tie into. But I see a conflict. Just a quick example, like maybe somebody that's 25, they're living with their parents still for maybe very good reasons, maybe economically or whatever good reasons. But there's a conflict of archetypes. Well, I'm supposed to be the adult, but I'm still living with my parents, so I have to kind of still play the role of a child as an archetype, even though I'm not a child. I'm in that dynamic. So now there's a conflict. We have students all the time, like people all the time come in their 20s and say, I'm frustrated and struggling because I'm caught between two big energies that I have to play.
Right.
And some of our advice sometimes contextually is like, well, maybe you need to go and be on your own and just fully embody that, or get yourself set for the next year or two and then be on your own. Like, ultimately, there's a maturation process that you have to graduate from childhood and become an adult. And I think that some people are caught, again, for probably very good reasons. It's not necessarily their fault all the time, but they're caught between these conflicting archetypal energies. And that can be very confusing because our culture is broken down to the place where we don't have these natural on-ramps for these things, these roles you're talking about going through life in.
Yeah, it used to be that we would end up in professional roles or in, blue collar or white collar. Like, those were archetypes of roles we would play. What socioeconomic level were we going to, see ourselves coming from? And I agree. I think we've democratized so many things that it's hard to know what our place is anymore or what our role is. And when I say know our place, I don't mean like, and stay there, right?
You're not allowed place.
Know your place and don't budge. No, I mean, like, what's my starting point? How does the world see me and how do I see myself?
Yeah.
And what are my archetypal energies that I'm working with? And what are my desired, what are the desired roles? And that there's travel time there. Like you said, one of the challenges of being an adult that lives at home with parents is that there's no clean lines, right? And usually we travel through, time and space and experience. We travel from a child role to an adult role. There's markers, there's mile markers along the way that let us know that we're entering that. And I'm seeing a ton of particularly millennials in their mid to late 30s right now that did like whatever those mile markers were, they missed them. And all of a sudden they're like, wait, I'm the adult?
Yeah.
Ding, right? I'm the adult? Wait, I'm the adult. I'm married. I have kids. I have a job. I guess that makes me the adult, right?
Yeah.
Almost like when all of those things happened, it didn't register that was the role they were now emerging into. And so archetypes can also let us know the kinds of things that are expected of us in the world. And so, again, it's all emergent. Like, all of these energies are things that they happen to us, basically. And so at the baseline of everything is, I think, a very valid question of what are the time, age, context, and relational archetypal roles that I should be recognizing? I might be living them, but am I recognizing them?
Yeah.
And what are the archetypal energies that I'm clinging to? And what are the archetypal energies that I'm resisting and rejecting, right? And how is that influencing me? Like, take, for example, when I discovered that I'm most aligned in the goddesses, I'm most aligned with Aphrodite. Go back and listen to that episode series if you'd like to. But we talked about Greek goddesses and Greek gods and how we tend to embody some of these archetypes. When I went through all of the goddesses and I was like, that doesn't really feel like me. That doesn't really feel like me, until I got to Aphrodite.
Yeah.
Explained a lot of stuff around sexual repression in my past. Oh, you're an Aphrodite archetype that was raised in a fundamentalist cult. Good luck with that, right? I'm like, that created a lot of weirdness inside of me. There was a lot of like, oh, I can't show cleavage, but I want to, but I can't, but I want to, but oh, I'm so awful if I do. Like, that's a really simple thought, right? That I battled with for probably 20 years, right? And so it's like, those are, why was that a thought in my head? Why was that something that was so, like why did that cause rift inside of my consciousness? Because I was a certain energy that was coming up, or archetype that was coming up against other archetypes that were not friendly to it. So some of them are roles that we emerge into. But some of them are, that's path, timeline, and path.
Yeah.
Then there are archetypes that we find ourselves attracted to and become. Then there are archetypes that are not time appropriate. They're not context appropriate. They are intrinsic. They are things that we didn't really get to choose. And I think that's a lot of why we are attracted to type, is type tells us the stuff that came from nature, right? And there are ways that nurture alter it, and we become this complex system of a bunch of different archetypal energies shoved into a single human being and human consciousness. But there's also things that we can't stop doing. Again, they're compulsions. They're the quote-unquote problems of type. And so separating them all out, right, filleting them all out, and trying to bifurcate all of these different components, is that there are roles that are assigned to us. There are roles we grow into, and there are roles that we can't stop heading towards, right? They come from within. There are characteristics that are assigned to us. There are characteristics that we grow into, and there are characteristics we are compelled to bring forward. And so this is one of the reasons why personality type starts out as a coloring book but ends up as a Van Gogh. It starts out with a very simple, real, I was about to say cheap description. It's not cheap, but a real basic description.
Accessible description.
Yes, very accessible.
Let's say.
Yeah. Free for all. Inexpensive. It's a very inexpensive access point of a description of what amounts to an archetype. A single archetype, right? As an ENTP, I was the inventor archetype. And here are certain things that come along with being an ENTP. Here's the profile. Here's the description. And that's one archetype. It doesn't explain the time period in my life that I'm in and the roles I'm playing based on the timeline. When I first ran into type, I was 14 years old. I'm now approaching 46. So my roles have changed many times from the moment I got introduced to the idea of having ENTP preferences to now. So all of that matters. All of that gets taken into consideration. The second thing is that there are certain roles or intrinsic things to being that I have as Antonia Dodge, the other ENTPs do not, right? Like I have an Aphrodite energy. I've met many ENTP women that have an Artemis energy, or they have an Athena energy, or they have even a Demeter energy or whatever, right? So there's lots of different things that make us unique individuals, even if we share type preferences. And then not only are there timeline roles, but there are things I've grown into because of the life choices I've made. Yeah. I decided I was going to be a parent, right? I chose to have children. Other ENTPs do not. So I have taken on the parental role, not just as something that I bring to situations or to my relationship to myself, but I also am literally a parent. Right? Yeah. That's a literal role that I occupy, and I have to be responsible to that. I can't let it go.
And to be fair, it's a challenge sometimes for you to tap into that archetype, that role. Even though you are a literal mother, it's like, oh, that's right, I got to be a mom today. Like you kind of have to remind yourself because it's not so natural to you, maybe.
That's right, exactly. And so I've had to grow into that, even though, I only had the one, right? There's a reason I only had the one. Because I'm like, I think this is not the thing that I'm best at, so maybe I shouldn't do it a whole bunch of times, right? Maybe I should just struggle to prepare one person for reality as opposed to a whole bunch of them. So that was something I grew into. And then there are characteristics that I intrinsically bring. And all of this matters. All of it helps diagnose a person's personality, right? Like you use that whole word, the personhood of individualism. And so I think what fundamentally kicked off this conversation is that we see so often questions about what should I be doing in life? Here's my type.
Yeah.
And they're real generic questions. And it's like, and I'm an INTJ, go. Right? And it's like, okay, I'm going to need a lot more information.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to need to know your age. I'm going to need to know your location. I'm going to need to know what you've already done.
Yeah.
I'm going to need to know the kinds of things that you, like how you see yourself. I'm going to need a ton more information.
It'd be like saying, I use a Mac operating system. What should I use my computer for? It's like, well, that's the operating system. You can use it for anything. I mean, like, what do you want to use it for? Right? I'm an INTJ. That's my operating system. That's how I'm making decisions. I'm learning information. What should I do with my life? It's like,
what software app should I write?
yeah, it's like, well, you just gave us the operators, what you're doing. Like, that's how you learn. That's how you decide. But we still need to know more information on what things light you up, what interests you have. Now, you might have some proclivity as an INTJ. There might be some aptitudes and some interests that we could predict, but not always, right? There's INTJs that run the gamut. So it's hard to know how to give specific things with just a type alone. I think that's where archetypes can be very helpful.
Yep. So the way that I have made this useful in my life is every time I run into a system, I see it first as archetypes.
Yeah.
Right? Every system of identity, every system of personality that I run into, I look for what the archetypes are trying to communicate. And then I figure out which ones I most align with. And then I figure out, or the question is, if every archetype is a role or a set of characteristics, what is the expectation for these archetypes? Right? What's the expectation for a parent? What's the expectation for a child? What's the expectation for a hero? Right? That's an archetype. What's the expectation for, like a mercenary?
Yeah, and I just had an idea too of an application here is to say, let's say I have a particular political persuasion, and the archetype of the other political persuasion in my mind is a villain, right? Or harmful. Like I've got this bad archetype. It's a general like archetype that's like puts in a category that can't be good. Well, what if we could look at somebody that's oppositional to us, maybe has a different political persuasion or different religion or different viewpoint socially or culturally or even idealistically or, core principle wise? What do we give the different characteristics to them archetypically? So it's an other archetype, but it's not like a villain or bad or wrong. Like we're not casting archetypes that make it so we can never hear from that person or that other side. We like cut ourselves off from information. So I think one way we could use archetypes is to use them better. Don't just cast simple archetypes, calcified one-note archetypes onto people. Don't project that outward. Try to get really nuanced and, okay, what does this actually represent?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I hear, when you talk about that, I hear the concept of the drama triangle. Yeah. Which is, in an oversimplified way, a hero, a villain, and a rescue. Or no, that's the hero. Hero, villain, and victim. Yeah, and according to the drama triangle, when you're caught in it, you see everything as being filtered through the lens of those three archetypes. And so it's like, well, if I'm villainizing people, is that a role I've assigned them? Is that how they see themselves? Do I get to decide that they are just that?
And does that automatically put me in the hero role, right? Or the victim role by definition, because I've defined them that way?
That's right. And I just get to be that single archetype energy. I am a villain. I am a victim. I am a victim. That's my only archetype. So that becomes very one note, right? If we only allow ourselves and other people to occupy a single archetype at that moment, right, as a whole identity, as a whole personhood, then that's incredibly limiting to identity. This is a little different than the concept of the shadow, because when we're in the shadow, we're usually playing just one archetypal role, because the shadow gets called up when we think we're in distress, when we think that we're being threatened. And so we don't usually have a complex orchestrated, like you said, quartet of archetype energies trying to navigate out of distress. We usually are like, what is it? Like flee. What is it? The three
things? Fight, flight, or flee.
Yeah, that's right. Or freeze.
Right?
Right?
Or freeze. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fight, flight, flee, and flight would be the same.
Yeah.
Why can't we remember the basic thing?
I
here,
don't
Antonia?
know.
What's wrong with us?
I knew they all started with F. I couldn't remember what the F words were.
Let's talk about really deep psychological Jungian terms. And it's like fight, freeze, flight. Like I can't remember the phrase.
What is the thing that we do when a predator shows up? Anyway, so so it's like it's a matter of just getting out of there or surviving the situation, which is usually very simple.
Yeah.
So, but that said, that we all occupy many different archetypes. So it's been very helpful for me. If we were to pretend to land the plane on this very abstract episode and say, go do a thing, it's been very helpful for me to list out the archetypes I believe that I'm working with right now, the ones that I was working with in the past and the ones that I think I'm growing into. Like the archetypes that I hope to be emerging into. Like right now, it's not a very nice name, but I hope to be emerging into the crone energy. For women, there's this idea of like the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The mating, of course, is when you're young, as a young woman. The mother is usually the natural progression, traditionally for women for millennia, to become a mother if one has the circumstances. And then eventually they become a crone, which is like the wise old woman who gives sage advice. And I'm hoping to move into the crone archetype. That's my future pacing for myself. And if I want to become a crone archetype, it means I have to have crone characteristics. I have to be wise. I have to be thoughtful.
Yeah.
I have to have something worth saying.
And just maybe a woman who doesn't identify with being a mother or never wants to be a mother, it still could be a parent role, contributing, building, creating something in the world, bringing advice to others. Like there's a parental role that I think everybody can go through, whether you're a physical, biological parent. There's still, again, the archetype you can tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody should, actually. Yeah. I think parent is a role that everybody should take on. And it's not just I get to tell people how to live their lives. Parenting is I'm responsible for...
It's a lot of thankless contribution is what it is.
It's a time period of relentless, thankless contribution.
Yeah, to somebody that's going to probably tell you you're bad and wrong for helping them.
And go get therapy for how terribly you treated them. That's right, exactly. And everybody should go through that, however that looks for them, you know, to find circumstances.
Well, there's a maturation process when you do that.
That's right.
Because it's one-sided by definition. You're giving and you're not getting. Mm-hmm. And I think it develops you in a certain way.
Yeah.
So, and literal parenthood can do that, but also tapping into that energy can do that. So
ostensibly, there's intrinsic reward, and they're cute when they're little.
Let's hope. Still roll the dice. So some things to reflect on then, as we're kind of landing the plane here. The first one was sitting down and kind of maybe sketching out some of the ways that, if you're listening or watching right now, where do you see archetypes showing up for you in life? Like, are you kind of taking on a parent role, whether you're a literal parent or not? I tend to, like, for example, take on a student role often. If somebody has like a body of knowledge, I will find myself immediately putting myself in like this student learning frame. Even in a subject that I know a lot about, I will almost automatically do it. So I don't threaten them, so I don't feel like I'm, challenging them. And then I always think, well, I can learn more. But the challenge is when I do that automatically, sometimes I diminish my authority, my standing, what I can bring to the world. So as an example, as you go through, if you're listening or watching this, you're going through the archetypes, just kind of say, is this serving me? If I'm in this archetype and I kind of see this coming up, like my immediate to go into the student role, I've identified that doesn't always serve me well. Sometimes, especially when I was younger, it was great because I could learn a lot. But now that I'm a little older, I need to be more in the teacher role, not the student role. I need to be more giving, not taking. And so I'm trying to kind of work with that energy. And now when I find myself just falling into that archetype, going, wait a minute, is this the right place that I want to be right now? Do I want to be at a different energy in this framework with this person? So that's something that I think you could identify in your own self. Do we have any other ideas of things we can look at?
Yeah, I think that idea of how much am I projecting archetypes onto other people as well is very helpful. The first thing is, what are my archetypes? The second is, what are the archetypes I'm projecting onto others? And am I limiting them by doing that? Am I seeing them single note? Am I assigning them roles and characteristics that are inappropriate to them, right? And can I reevaluate that? Particularly when they're oversimplified archetypes.
Like Karen. Mm-hmm. Like a Karen archetype is an oversimplified archetype. Clearly, this middle-aged person who's trying to keep the world right or correct has a bunch of other stuff going on. They're not just one note. Now, that's the only note I might see of them, or you might see of them, but clearly they're an entire human being with a bunch of things running. This isn't just the sum total of who they are.
Right, yeah. And what are the archetypes I'm signaling, right? Like a Karen in that moment, I guess, I'm sorry to all the Karens of the world.
I would hate to have a name Karen right now.
I know. I'll say shrew, because that's what we used to call them. If I have shrew energy and I'm showing up to the world with that energy, how far do I think I'm going to get, right? And why am I doing that, right? What am I projecting a sense of disempowerment in my life onto the outside world? Am I trying to correct things in the outside world because I'm avoiding, focusing on core issues? Like, what exactly is going on for me when I show up with this archetype energy? What is it communicating to others and myself about where I'm at?
Yeah.
And so archetypes can also, like the energies we show up with can... they have meaning, and they can lead us to understandings and insights and ahas about ourselves. If I'm showing up constantly prepared for war, well, what does that tell me? Right? Or if I'm constantly showing up, like you said, as a student or as a child, what is that telling me about the position I see myself in, in my life?
Yeah.
And so archetypes can also, they're incredible diagnostic tools. They diagnose what is true about ourselves and what isn't, right? What are the things I wish were the energies I could move into, but they're just actually not, they're not really authentic to me, versus the ones that I might be avoiding or pushing away for whatever reason. That's too cool. I'm not allowed to be that. Or I don't really want to see myself as having those shortcomings, or I'm not ready for that assignment. like maybe I'm not ready to grow up or whatever. What are the things I'm resisting and why? What does it tell me about myself that I find myself in these positions? So what are your archetypes? And again, laying down those 3 tracks, there's archetypes of that show up on a timeline. When I'm a kid, I'm supposed to be in the kid archetype. That's appropriate for that time period. But when I'm an adult, I'm supposed to be in the many available adult archetypes, right? There's a lot of them, but I'm supposed to be in one of those. I'm not supposed to be in child energy all the time. I'm not supposed to see myself as a child. And then when I get older into the future, right, maybe I'm aging, middle-aged, or possibly in my elderhood, what are the archetypal energies that show up there? And I'm embodying them. Now, there is something to be said for having a part of you that maybe has like a cord to childhood. When you become older in your elderhood, it's nice to still have retained some of that childlike wonder for the universe. You don't want to let go of those archetypes. But is that your front facing? Is that your primary interface with the rest of the world, that you see that other people are supposed to take care of you, which is the child archetype? Come take care of me. So that's the first track. What are the archetypes for the timeline of humans, right? And am I on pace? Am I experiencing the archetype energies that are appropriate for my age? Then there's the archetype energies that I'm growing into because of my life choices, right? I resist the mother archetype energy. I just do. But I chose to be a mom, so here I go, right?
Yeah.
Like I can only resist it so much before I go, well, abortion isn't legal at 10. I can't kill her right now. So I guess I'm just going to have to be a mom, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be highly offensive to somebody. I'm going to get so many emails. But anyway, the point is that yeah, I got to be a mom. I just do. So I have to grow into it because of the choices I made. And that archetype energy is available to me, right? It's inside of me. I just got to go find it and stop resisting it. And then finally, what are the archetype energies that are intrinsic to me that I just came out of the package with? And I can't do anything about that. I'm always going to be attracted to those things. And so listing those out and going, am I on pace? Am I fulfilling my roles and obligations for life? Have I set myself up in life? Have I established myself so that I can take care of myself and others if that's necessary? Am I being authentic to who I am based on what I know about myself with these intrinsic characteristics that keep coming up over and over?
Yeah.
Am I being true to myself? And is there any lesson for me when I watch myself get into certain energies? What's the message that even if it's just a momentary archetype, right? I'm sure a Karen is not a Karen. I'm sure a shrew is not a shrew in every situation. So why is that person being a shrew in that one moment, right? What's going on for them? So the archetype energies that we experience, what are they telling us about ourselves? What wisdom and insight do they have for us? And I think that's one of the reasons why we like models so much, is that they provide a ton of archetype content, right? It doesn't matter what system you're looking at. You're probably looking at archetypes. So you can track and trace these things out in a self-reflective way. You can observe your behavior in response to others and gain insights around there. And then you can ask yourself, where am I headed? And how do I pick up the skills I need, or change my attitude, or alter how I see things, or make peace with reality, or whatever it is, to be able to grow into the roles that are coming for me in the future.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some discussion started around this. What do you think? What's coming up for you as you're listening along? This idea of archetypes, personality types. What archetypes are you immediately identifying, the roles you're playing in your life? And are they serving you? Do you want to alter these or change them? Have you changed archetypes in the past? Come over to personalityhacker.com, and directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story about some of the things we're talking about. Where does this resonate with you? Where does it not resonate with you? What are you seeing come up in your own life? Again, we want to have you reflect back on your experience, because we want personality types to come alive in your life. We want you to be able to use this to have better relationships, find the career path that serves you, set up an ergonomic life, tailored for you. Now, it's not always going to be easy. Sometimes you still have struggle, even in ergonomic lives. But it's a life that juices you up. You get excited about getting up to every day. And we believe that understanding some of the basic principles of personality types can help you unlock setting up that ergonomic situation. So come over to personalityhacker.com, directly below this episode, make your voice heard, and let us know what you're thinking.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot. You may be watching us right now on YouTube because we also have a video podcast, and I highly recommend going and checking it out. And then you can watch all the nature around us to figure out why it was so noisy on the audio podcast with all the rain. Like, oh, that was that puddle that the streaming water kept splashing into. Now I can see it. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can like, subscribe, and hit the little bell that lets you know when future episodes are out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And it's a really good book. It took us a long time to write. And it's set up with journal prompts and ways to not just read about your type, but also do a lot of inner inquiry and self-exploration around your type. That's because that's our jam. So go check out that book, and we hope you enjoyed that one.
Yeah.
Well, you said yeah, but I have
just...
one more little bit of my thing that I'm supposed to say at the end.
Please end well. I was getting ready to like wrap it all up, but please go ahead and end well.
We highly recommend you go over to personalityhacker.com and look at our suite of programs. We create personal growth-oriented programs where we use type and archetypes and an understanding of all these different models and systems to dive deeper into who we are, who we're meant to be, and address pain points. There are certain things that come along with being wired the way that you're wired. Certain pain points that are not unique human experiences, but unique to you and how you're experiencing them, and also unique to you and how you grow past them and emerge on the other side. So we recommend that you head over to personalityhacker.com and maybe check out the owner's manual for your personality type. That's the best place to start because it helps you understand the intricacies of your type, gives a bit of an overview, but at the same time helps you understand your cognition and things that are going to show up in a very particular order based on your car model. So we recommend that you give it a gander.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.